Hi, Book 2. Today will be my review of Resurrection Day by Brendan Dubois. I'm always tempted to say Dubois for whatever reason. I'm tempted to say it, but I really don't know how to pronounce it. But I think the most accurate is Dubois. I had my book rebounded, so it was a soft cover with a step back. But I had it rebound into a hardcover at the local print shop because the front pages were falling out when I got it. And it's a second-hand book that I bought from Tokopedia, which is an Indonesian online seller. So, what is this book about? Well, this is another alternate history novel that I've read that asks the question, what would happen if the Cuban Missile Crisis went hot in 1962? The story takes place 10 years later from the events of 1962. So first let me explain the world this book is set in. Not the world in terms of the political arrangement, but in terms of the consequences of nuclear war in 1962. From the outset, I will have to say that I'm sorry, but this book is just not plausible. Not plausible, for multiple reasons. Now, the book does mention massive deaths, massive suffering, and hellscapes. You will find that in this book. I will grant the author that. But despite the amount of hellscapes that the book does describe, this might sound like I'm bloodthirsty or something, but it's still unrealistic. It's not a total apocalypse like what nuclear war would result in. Now, so the Mad Max style hellscape that you would expect from a nuclear war story does exist in Siberia and a lot of East Asia as well. So the hellscapes that you would expect in this book do exist in this book, but only in Asia and Siberia. Western Europe and the nations of Western Europe remain relatively intact, and the United States has been severely weakened, and millions of people have died, and they are no longer a superpower. So there are consequences to nuclear war. It is the situation in the United States is grim, but the integrity of the nation state remains. I found that very, very unrealistic. So it's as if there was total nuclear war for Russia, for the Soviet Union, and only limited nuclear war for the United States. And when I say a limited nuclear war, some people have said it. Think of like a nuclear exchange between Pakistan and India, for example. It might not result in the total annihilation of civilization. Now, short of human extinction, total nuclear war would result in humanity surviving in small pockets of habitability. Because beyond the initial blast, there is radiation in the clouds, there is radiation in the ground, so the cancer rates would skyrocket. The initial blast of a nuclear bomb, I must say. And so there's that, and then there's the nuclear winter, which will cut electricity for millions, and which will cause food shortages and people freezing to death from the cold. freezing to death from the cold. There's food shortages, so they'll starve to death. And then people also, and yeah, they will freeze to death because of the power outages. Yeah. So all those consequences would result in the integrity of nation states totally destroyed. The nation states would totally be annihilated, and humans would live in these small pockets. So it's weird. The distribution of destruction around the world is very disproportionate. So there is hellscapes in North America, but it's not a total hellscape like you would find in Siberia and in China and in parts of northern India and in Central Asia. Western Europe remains relatively untouched. So it's a disproportionate. It's disproportionate the consequences of nuclear war. So very, very, very unrealistic. Now, despite the implausibility of Resurrection Day, the story itself and the world that Brendan Dubois built is still a fascinating world to explore. Now, let's talk about, okay, so in the United States, the consequences of nuclear exchange is the Soviet Union with missiles struck some military bases and some major urban areas, some big cities. So there are some pockets, some parts of the United States that become uninhabitable. But and then as a consequence, millions more suffer from freezing to death, from starving, etc. But other than that, the United States and the United States government remains intact. Washington D.C. is flattened, and and most of the administration is wiped out. And Mitt Romney's father, I believe his name was George Romney. I could be wrong. Romney Sr. A Republican, is president in 1972 alternate United States. So the book doesn't go outside of the United States except a little bit into Canada. Anyway, but the United States, despite its massive suffering, despite it being reduced in power, the integrity of the state remains relatively intact, and the capital is Philadelphia. Is now Philadelphia. And and meanwhile, in the United Kingdom, there is a resurgent British Empire. Because of the breakdown of law and order in most parts of the world, and with the United States being emasculated, and with the destruction of the Soviet Union, the British Empire, which was already in decline in the mid-1950s, has come back to fill the vacuum. And a lot of people have pointed this out. That's also very unrealistic because the UK was already in decline. The British Empire was already in decline. But in this book, there's a resurgent British Empire. So I ask you readers, I ask you guys, would you prefer the British as the world police or the Americans? That's something that this book raises, the question this book raises. And, oh, by the way, and the United States is the only country that retains its nuclear arsenal. And there seems to be like this, and then after the nuclear war itself, there's this, in my opinion, unrealistic worry that nuclear war will come back in the very near future when everyone except the United States has given up their nuclear weapons. So there is this unrealistic worry that the Cold War will resume somehow in the very near future that the characters express. So, a resurgent British Empire, many nation states still maintaining their integrity, very, very unrealistic. And the United States being emasculated or castrated, that I find realistic. So bringing the United States down a peg that it cannot influence the rest of the world, that it's severely weakened. A lot of Americans with their pride, a lot of Americans think their geography will make them always be powerful in the world. I don't agree with that. So the United States being reduced to a third-rate power, that I can believe, but you're welcome to disagree with me on that. Now, I've talked about the setting this whole time because there's so much I want to say about this book. I neglected to talk about the story itself. So, in Boston, there is a newspaper journalist named Carl Landry. He one day comes across a murder of a United States veteran in his apartment. And as he tries to investigate what happened to this man, to this United States veteran, and the clues, and what happened to this United States veteran, and the more he tries to push for the truth, the more the government and the people around him seem to try to put roadblocks in his way into finding out the truth. And this is not a spoiler. This is just me telling you right now. This is not a spoiler because I'm not going to get into the details. But that veteran, because I'm not going to get into details, so that veteran who was murdered holds the information or the key to the truth of what happened, what exactly happened in 1962. So Carl Landry goes on this journey, goes on this investigation to find out the truth of what happened in 1962, starting with that one murder of that veteran. Along the way, he recruits the help of a British journalist named Sandra. I forgot her full name. And they also make their way into post-apocalyptic New York City. They start in Boston, Massachusetts, and find their way in post-apocalyptic Manhattan. Yes. And of course, meanwhile, by the way, I didn't mention this. The United States is heavily dependent on British aid for relief efforts and recovery efforts. So they're really, really heavily dependent on the British. Meanwhile, the British or factions in the UK government and factions in the British military have a certain malevolent, malicious plan, a conspiracy that you're going to have to read this book to know about. I won't say more lest I give away the spoilers, lest I give any spoilers. So, and that evil plan is very unrealistic and ridiculous in some ways. And some of the people within the British government and in the British military are already expressing their reservations or their feeling that this is absurd, this is ridiculous. But certain factions are pushing for this plan to go along. And the main villain in this book is the person who ultimately is responsible for what happened in 1962. John F. Kennedy died in a nuclear blast in DC, similar to in the Hot War trilogy, what happened to Stalin in Harry Turtledove's Hot War trilogy. But this one, it's JFK who dies in a nuclear blast. Now, who's ultimately responsible for making for making everything go wrong, no diplomatic solution, is the main villain in this book. I won't give his name because I want you to find out for yourself. So the truth of exactly how he's responsible is what Carl Landry is investigating. Now, there was one thing on my mind. This is the trouble with unscripted videos. These things slip your mind. Oh yeah, and it's 1972, an election year. Finding out the truth before the election day, the stakes are high to find out the truth. So then there's like a fair election, because now the Republican Party is like almost certainly certain to win all the time after the disastrous JFK administration. And finally, now I remember. And it seems the United States of 1972 in this book has not learned the right lessons. Of the consequences of nuclear war. They maintain their nuclear arsenal. They are mostly isolationist, except for taking relief from their British allies. They don't want to have diplomacy with the rest of the world, because that's what they think JFK's outlook was. Like, diplomatic solution is the way. And then the reaction is, no, isolationism is the way to prevent nuclear war. So and we still have to hold on to our nuclear weapons. Without them, we will not survive. So it seemed that the United States learned all the wrong lessons. And understandably, because that's what they think the consequences of JFK's policies were. John F. Kennedy. Okay, I've rambled on about this book. I had a lot to say. How would I rate this book? I'd give it a 7 out of 10. It's an extremely, extremely unrealistic book, implausible alternate history, but it is still a fascinating and exciting story. Fascinating and exciting. Would I live in this hellish world? Hell no. No way. But it is fascinating. It is a fascinating read. And it is an interesting lesson on the consequences of... so there's some philosophical and political stuff here. There is some discussion about valuing freedom and the value of... the importance of having a diplomatic solution, and the consequences of your actions, of the consequences of war, so the importance of having diplomatic solutions. And there is, of course, the philosophical discussion of, are we losing our civil liberties? Because the United States is, in this book, under martial law. Wow. So there is that. I don't know how long this video went for, but I hope you enjoy. 7 out of 10. Would I recommend it? If you're really, really, really interested, yes. But if you only have a milder interest in this kind of stuff, no. Excuse me. I forgot to add that the characters in this book have a very strange kind of dialogue. So there's a lot of information dumps as they talk. So despite the urgency of various given situations, despite the urgency, like, oh, we got a deadline to get to, or there's no time, the bomb is ticking, etc., they seem to find a lot of spare time to have a lot of back and forth dialogue, or a lot of reminiscing flashbacks about things that happened in the past and how they got to the point where they are now. So it's strange. There's a lot of dialogue or internal reminiscing in this book that is very unrealistic given the urgency of situations. So the story itself, the present day story, seems less important than the events that have already happened. So I found that a kind of weird method of storytelling. Yeah, that's it. That's all I have to say.